Businesses and households are confident and spending, even though the share market is tumbling. A major deal between a gig economy company and a union, and an Andy Warhol silkscreen of Marilyn Munro sells for a record $195 million. It's Wednesday, the 11th of May, 2022. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael. Can you imagine spending $195 million US, what's that, about 270 million Australian, on a painting? Not even a painting, a silkscreen.
A silkscreen. No, look, I wouldn't for a silkscreen. I probably would for a painting, but no, I draw the line at a silkscreen.
Or an NFT or something like that, maybe?
Yeah, no, it's a whole nother level of wealth, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
When you're talking about splashing that kind of cash on an artwork, we are in a whole nother realm there.
Yeah, I mean, really, I suppose it's an investment as much as it is appreciation of the art, because the art can't be worth that, surely.
No, and now that's why we call you Sean Art Critic Aylmer.
Every day I get a new line. Like, what was yesterday's? Silver lining?
Silver linings Aylmer, because of your ability to find the silver lining in all negative economic news. So, which is pretty impressive, really.
Well, economists are called dismal scientists because with all the good news, there's always bad news. But the counterpoint to that is with all the bad economic news, there's always good economic news.
Oh, goodness me. And just like that, you transition back from Sean Art Critic Aylmer to Sean Silver Linings Aylmer. I can barely keep track of all your nicknames, and I'm sure there'll be a third one before we get to the end of the show. Speaking of the end of the show, Sean, afterwards, you have a terrific chat today with Tim Dring from EY about all the recent bank results.
Yes, Tim is an expert on the big four banks in Australia, and he sat down and got the results of the big four. Three have reported in the last week, and Commonwealth Bank about 3 months ago, crunched all the numbers and came up with what's good, what's bad, what to look out for, etc. Great interview.
Yeah, it really is. The main story this morning, though, Sean, is all about confidence. Australian businesses are confident and they're enjoying strong trading conditions, even while equity markets are tumbling.
Yes, that was really the headline from a slew of economic releases yesterday. The latest National Australia Bank survey shows that the corporate mood is still well above average levels and conditions in most industries look pretty good. But, and it's a big but, higher costs pose a significant challenge to trading conditions. The survey confirms all the anecdotal evidence coming out of companies about higher supply chain and raw material costs, and there's certainly a shortage of workers, adding to wage pressures. So while markets tumble, the ASX fell further yesterday. I'll tell you about that in a moment. Business is actually pretty upbeat.
And Sean, households are spending as well. Retail sales jumped in the first quarter of the year with $93 billion going through Australian cash registers.
That's right. It was a record quarter and 1.2% higher than the December quarter, nearly 5% higher than a year earlier. The biggest rise came in cafes, restaurants and takeaway food services, thanks, of course, to the easing of COVID restrictions. But general retailing, clothing and footwear, department stores all recorded significant increases. Not surprisingly, food retailing fell because people were once again eating out. And food retailing captures all the big supermarkets.
Sean, retail sales, does that include online sales as well?
It does, yes.
So really, the saying going through the cash registers, which has been in use for years and years, probably needs a bit of an update.
I think so. I'm not quite sure what the going through the payments system mechanism doesn't quite have the same ring, does it?
No, really doesn't. Anyway, we'll work on that one. That's my homework, to come up with a better way, a more modern way of referring to Australian cash registers. But also, Sean, the Bureau also released monthly turnover information for the month of March.
Yeah, this is really interesting because it shows that in 12 of the 13 sectors that the Bureau measures, there's been an increase in turnover. Now, that's pretty broad-based. That's telling you your economy is doing pretty well. Now, the easing of COVID restrictions resulted in a massive 18% rise in arts and recreation services and a 6% jump in accommodation and food services. Rising electricity prices boosted that sector, and higher prices helped construction and mining. Only wholesale trade went backwards.
So if I was to try and kind of summarize it all in a sentence, the real economy seems to be performing pretty well, but investors don't seem to believe it.
Yes, that's actually very well put. There seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the sell-off in markets at the moment, and reports from businesses, including, of course, the three big banks over the past week. The local share market dropped to its lowest point in 3 months yesterday morning, falling below 6,940 points. Now, the two big factors dominating most developed equity markets at the moment, including the ASX, are rising interest rates and inflation in the US and fears of a dramatic slowdown in China due to Beijing's zero-tolerance policy for COVID. Eventually, the S&P ASX 200 came off its lows, and during the afternoon yesterday, it trended up. It finished down 1% at 7,051 points. Michael, there is plenty going on. The price of gold has fallen further, notwithstanding it remains at an historically high level of about $1,860 an ounce. That hit the big miners. Newcrest Mining and Northern Star both closed down 4%. Chalice Mining was off more than 6%. Iron ore prices have also fallen back below $120 a tonne. That hit the big miners. Rio was down 3.6%. Fortescue and BHP were both down around 2.6%. Brent crude was also lower yesterday after the European Union softened its proposed sanctions on Russian crude. That hit Woodside. It was down 2.6%. Santos ended 1.7% lower. The banks were down, so too the retailers and the telcos. But the tech stocks rebounded, led by Xero, WiseTech Global and REA. Remember, they're the ones that have been sold off as things have been getting better. But when things look tough, the tech stocks win.
All right, what happened away from equities yesterday?
Well, the Aussie dollar fell below 69.5 US cents. That's its lowest level in nearly 2 years. The sell-off in global equities and falling commodity prices are hurting the local currency, but bond yields are having a great time. With rates rising, so too are yields, and 3-year bonds are fetching around 3.15%. 10-year bonds are at 3.6%. That's much better than a term deposit.
And Sean, it's always worth following the money, and no one has more money than Australian Super, the country's largest pension fund.
It's about to quadruple its exposure to private equity investments around the world to $50 billion. It'll do that over the next 5 years. Aussie Super manages around $260 billion. And when you have that much money, you have to work pretty hard to find somewhere to put it. Private equity seems to be the flavour of the month for Aussie Super at the moment.
All right, there we go. Big start. Plenty happening. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. All right, Sean, let's talk elections. What's the latest campaign news?
Prime Minister Scott Morrison was doing the media rounds yesterday, criticising the Labor Party for not having a plan for government. It's a louder refrain from critics of Labor in recent times. Critics are saying they're not ready to govern and can't articulate a plan, and it seems to be gaining some traction, hence Scott Morrison's use of it yesterday. Mr Morrison also promised $220 million for an upgrade to a bridge in the Sydney seat of Bennelong, which is held by retiring Liberal MP John Alexander. Anthony Albanese had another day of clarifying earlier comments. A little familiar, that one. This time on the minimum wage. In the morning, he said he didn't support the ACTU campaign to increase the minimum wage by 5.5%, but by the afternoon, he did. Mr Albanese was on the hustings in Victoria and committed $2 billion towards Melbourne's suburban rail loop if Labor wins. Also, Michael, former Federal Education Minister Alan Tudge has broken his silence since stepping down following allegations that he'd been abusive to former staffer Rachel Miller. He said he was ready to step back into the ministry if the coalition wins next Saturday.
Okay, Sean, we mentioned at the top of the show this story, and I think this is really interesting. Delivery group DoorDash has pledged to work with the Transport Workers Union to regulate the gig economy.
Yes, and that includes developing minimum rights and conditions for on-demand delivery riders. It's a significant step for gig economy employees, and during the next few years will establish overtime and fair pay for DoorDash workers. The Charter of Principles signed by both parties is the first of its kind between an Australian union and a delivery platform, according to the Financial Review. The union said it recognised the flexible nature of gig work while agreeing to the need for enforceable industry-wide standards set by an independent body. DoorDash is the biggest delivery platform in the US and has been in Australia since 2019. Now, the deal will put pressure on the federal government and other gig economy companies to develop minimum pay and conditions for gig economy workers. Labor has already promised to do that if it wins government.
Okay. Now, Sean, wholesale gas prices are rising fast, which is, well, it's bad news for households.
Exactly. Eventually, higher wholesale prices will feed through to more expensive electricity for all of us. And the current spike has come ahead of winter when, of course, demand surges. Wholesale gas prices have at least tripled in recent weeks to $30 a gigajoule in Melbourne and $22 a gigajoule in Sydney. The spike reflects outages at some coal-fired power stations across the national electricity market, and also because international prices for LNG are high thanks to the war in Ukraine. While there's no doubt Australia needs to phase out fossil fuels, the price hike is a reminder of the cost if that phasing occurs too quickly. It's a really interesting debate at the moment.
Yeah, it sure is. Now, Western Australia yesterday, Sean, reported its worst ever day for COVID cases, 12,390.
Yes, it's a real case of two steps forward, one step back when it comes to COVID news. Yesterday morning, we were welcoming lower cases and fewer deaths, but today we're lamenting a record day in Western Australia, which of course reflects the easing of restrictions in the West. There was also a sharp spike in cases in Victoria to 12,722, the highest daily case number in that state in 3 months. New South Wales reported 10,300 cases yesterday. There were 6,700 infections in Queensland, 3,700 cases in South Australia, and around 1,000 in both Tasmania and the ACT.
All right. Now, this next one came as a bit of a surprise. It seems the Northern Territory Chief Minister, Michael Gunner, has resigned, saying his head and heart are no longer in the job.
Mr Gunner is the first born and bred Territorian to become Chief Minister. He's had the role since 2016. Now, while in the job, he suffered a heart attack. He also now has 2 children, one which was born only a few weeks ago. Yesterday, he said it was time to become more of a family man. And as you mentioned, he didn't have his head and heart fully in the job. So it was time to step down.
Oh, good luck to him. Now, Atlas Arteria has reported poor traffic flows on its Washington, D.C. toll road.
Yes, it's really struggling in the US with traffic flows not what they expected. In fact, they're about a third of what they had hoped they'd be. But the group is doing really well on its French road toll. Its share price was flat yesterday, but it's up 12% over the past year.
Staying on the road, so to speak, Sean, the WA government will tomorrow announce a $60 million electric vehicle package as part of the state budget.
Yes, the package is forecast to reduce emissions by at least 7,000 tonnes a year and will include a rebate of $3,500 to buyers of new electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles that are worth up to $70,000. The government's numbers say it will save owners more than $1,400 a year in fuel costs. The budget will also include money for charging infrastructure.
And one last quick one. Fund manager Pendal says its first half profit rose 7.5% and it boosted its dividend by 24%.
Yes, that was in part due to the contribution of US-based subsidiary Thomson Segal Walmsley. Earnings per share jumped more than 30%, which is a really good outcome for the fund manager. Its share price rose 7.8% yesterday, one of the best on the market.
Okay, moving on to overseas news. Now, Philip Morris International is close to buying European rival Swedish Match for around $16 billion US.
That's right. Tobacco groups around the world are betting on the rapidly growing market for cigarette alternatives. Match is the leader in so-called snus, or oral nicotine pouches, according to the Financial Times. Philip Morris is among the most aggressive companies in an industry scrambling to make inroads in new generation products, including vapes and heated tobacco devices, which are pitched as less harmful than combustible cigarettes. Tobacco companies remain really big businesses. We tend to forget about them because many investors won't go near them for ESG reasons. But British American Tobacco, for example, is the 8th largest group on the FTSE 100 in London, and there's so much activity going on in that market.
That's an interesting one. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has won an emphatic victory in the Philippines presidential election.
His family returns to power 36 years after his dictator father fled the country. With about 94% of votes counted, Marcos Jr. has about twice as many votes as his rival. Now, the official result isn't expected for a couple of weeks, but financial markets have already moved. The Philippine equity index fell about 3% yesterday.
And Sean, I know everyone is hanging out to hear more insights from Sean, art critic Aylmer, about the silkscreen of Marilyn Munro by Andy Warhol, sold at Christie's for a record $195 million US. Tell us about the artwork, please, Sean, in detail.
Oh, look, I'm sure you'd know the artwork. It's Marilyn with yellow hair and blue eyeshadow and pink face and very, very bright red lipstick.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. No, I think everyone knows that one, actually.
Yeah. It's iconic and really expensive. In fact, the price was the highest ever for a 20th century artwork, to sell at auction at least. It's the highest price ever for an American work and the second most expensive artwork in history. Do you know what the other one is, Michael?
Oh, well, actually, I do.
Well,
Only because a little while ago we spoke on Fear and Greed to an art expert who told us the story of this Da Vinci work being auctioned and just the phenomenal price and the silence in the room when it cracked this record figure.
yes, $450 million US dollars. Salvator Mundi, which is the Leonardo da Vinci piece. That's the most expensive in history. So $450 million US dollars. This one's at $195 million US dollars, number 2. Interestingly, the buyer was a dealer and the sale was made in about 3.5 minutes.
It's not a bad little bit of work for the auctioneer, would it? I don't know what their cut is on.
25 million.
Really?
Or thereabouts. Yep.
Once again, I know I've said this many times, Sean, but you and I are in completely the wrong business. 3.5 minutes and that $25 million. Wow. All right, I'm just going to sit down for a minute. I'm glad we're going to wrap this up. Up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview. You are speaking with Tim Dring, banking expert from EY.
Yes, as I mentioned at the top of the show, we talked about the major bank results, Westpac, National Australia Bank and ANZ, which have all reported in the last week. Commonwealth Bank reported 3 months ago. Really, it's pretty forward-looking about sort of parts of the market where they can make money, how they can save money, and new areas that he expects the banks to get into.
$25 million for 3.5 minutes work. Oh, it's going to take me a while to get over that. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It is Wednesday, the 11th of May, 2022. Make sure you're following the podcast. Join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And why not have a go at listening to us as well through your smart speaker? Just ask your smart speaker, whether it's Siri or Google Home or Alexa, to play the Fear and Greed podcast, and away you go. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.